Renzo Severino is a fifth-year Ph.D. candidate in public policy at Duke University and a fellow in the Heyden Fellowship program. His research focuses on student minorities within the school system in Peru and their interaction with their peers and other actors in and outside of school. Renzo's dissertation examines the effect of increased immigrant presence in Peruvian high schools on the performance of Native students. Additionally, Renzo is a co-PI in a randomized controlled trial that provides native language sexual education to communities in rural Peru. Before coming to Duke, Renzo majored in economics at Universidad del Pacifico. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hi, thank you for having me here. I'm going to talk about part of my dissertation research, and it's about immigration in Peru. I think immigration is a topic that's talked about all the time, but I still want to go over a few reasons as to why I study immigration in this context. So first reason is that there's a lot of misconceptions about immigrants, and this is what drew me into this topic at first. There's sometimes this idea that more immigrants will make it harder for natives to get a job, which is usually not the case, or that immigrant students will lower the performance of native students, and that is also not always the case. We don't know enough this last part, the educational impacts of immigration, and what we do know is mostly for developed countries, the US, for Denmark, for the UK, not much for immigration within the global south, and that is a big gap in the literature and in the policy sphere, especially since in the 90s, migration within the global south was even higher than migration from south to north, so from developing to developed countries. This changed a bit 15 years later, but then in 2020, again, migration within developing countries is a bigger portion of the total migrant stock in the world than migration from south to north. And so having more evidence and more policy recommendations for developing countries is important because they are fundamentally different than developed countries. An immigration shock may look different if there's different infrastructure constraints, if there's different political institutions. And so this is why I think it's important to study immigration within developing countries. In the particular case of my research, I focus on the Venezuelan exodus into neighboring countries in South America. This is something that started in 2015 and went on at least until 2019 and then changed a bit with COVID. This project focuses on the shock that occurred from 2015 to 2019. So Venezuela had around 30 million people and around 3 million people left the country. There was a combination of hyperinflation, scarcity, and a rise in criminality, and most people left for neighboring countries. The main destination was Colombia. The second destination was Peru. Peru had, in 2015, before this shock, only around 8,000 Venezuelan citizens in the whole country, and then 4 years later, almost 800,000. It's a big change, and the way people, the way teachers in schools, the way parents saw Venezuelans changed radically, because before there was no interaction with them, and now there were a lot of Venezuelans in schools. This is different than other migration stories because it's not parents or a husband going abroad and then sending remittances. This is both male and female immigrants, and in a lot of cases, children. So these were whole families moving into Peru, and that means it's going to have an impact in the demand for schooling services. And this is indeed what we see when we look at the A graders, we see the red line is the number of students that are non-Peruvian, non-Venezuelan, remains stable. This other line is the Peruvians, also remains stable, and the Venezuela number increases exponentially. This is logarithms, so it just increases so much that it even surpasses the combination of all other nationalities in the school system. And I'm focusing on the A grade because that's a grade when the Ministry of Education gives a standardized test, and so I can use a standardized test scores as a measure of academic performance. Okay, so this is what basically happened. It's a big introduction of immigrants into Peruvian schools, and because this is an economics project, I have a very specific question, and the question is, what is the effect of having more immigrant classmates on the academic performance of natives? As I mentioned before, this has been researched in other contexts. The latest paper for the US has some positive estimates using school registry in Florida. In other contexts, there's no clear answer. And here, again, because this is an economics project, I'm going to answer the question right away. There's a negative effect of having one more immigrant as your classmate. It's a small-ish reduction on academic performance of 1.8% standard deviations in math and 1.2% standard deviations in reading. This is a medium-sized effect in the education literature. For context, there was a big class reduction experiment in Tennessee, the STAR project, which is one of the better identified, one of the best projects in education. And this project basically compared classrooms without class reduction and classrooms with fewer students, and found between 15 and 20% increase in academic performance. And that's a big effect. Here we have just 1.8%, 1.2%. But this is per additional immigrant. So if a classroom had 4 more immigrants, we would have around 7% of a decrease in performance. So that's about the magnitudes. The direction of the fact that it's negative, I think that's important to talk about. So we see that it's causal because of the methods I'm going to discuss later. One more immigrant is causing the performance of the native student to decrease. But we should understand what mechanisms are behind that. So to expand on that, if we were to look at the effect of having a new student in a school, even a new native student, we will actually see a similar effect. An effect that is similar not only in size, but also in how it interacts with other variables. And so what seems to be happening is not conclusive, but it's a very suggestive pattern that what's important, what's causing this negative effect is the newness of the kid. So it doesn't matter whether the new kid is Venezuelan or Peruvian, the fact that the kid is new to the school is somehow causing a decrease in performance of the other students. And that is important for policy because it's different to focus on training teachers to accommodate new students than focusing on policies designed only for immigrants. There's additional discussion about how this new kid is affecting the other kids. From what I can measure, it's because the kids that were already in school are exerting less effort than before. So they're probably spending time either befriending or antagonizing the new kids, but not as much time as they were before studying. So that's the answer. We could stop there, but I'm gonna get into more details. So how do I arrive to this conclusion? I have this data is standardized test scores for all the 8th graders in Peru from 2015 to 2019, except 2017, because there was a nationwide teacher strike, so no one went to school that year. And then I have a measure of how much effort a student exerts. This is not, well, it's obviously subjective, and it's not exactly effort. It's what's called independent learning, which is considered a subject in Peru, in at least starting in 2019. And it's supposed to reflect how much the student sets their own goals and fulfills their own goals in the teacher's view. The treatment is basically the number of Venezuelan students in a classroom, and I can observe the sex of the student, a socioeconomic index, their age, whether they're new to the high school or not, some report card grades, both for the 8th grade that they're in now, from the past. And so, as I said, I have 4 years. I have around 190,000 students and 8,000 classrooms. Right? So, there's a couple of concerns here. The first one is that immigrants don't choose a school randomly. So, if what we have are immigrants of lower income, they might go to schools where Peruvians were already underperforming. And then we will see that Peruvians who are around Venezuelans are performing worse than other Peruvians, but it's not because of the Venezuelans, it's because they were already in bad schools, right? So, and the same if we were to get immigrants of higher income, they will go to good schools, and then we will confound the fact that they are around Peruvians who perform well with a causal effect. So instead of looking at the whole school system, we're going to focus and look at a set of schools which have different number of Venezuelans in different classrooms, and we're going to compare one classroom to another. I'm going to make this more explicit in a second. Another concern is that natives may change schools in response to the presence of immigrants, which is a well-documented fact here in the US. It's called native flight or white flight. Happened a lot during the 90s, where more Hispanics were moving to the country. Parents would try to reallocate their children to other schools because they didn't want their children to interact with immigrants. And so if this happens and the native children who move are the ones who are performing better before moving, then it will look as if the Venezuelans are causing lower performance, when it's not the case. It's just that the ones who stay with the immigrants in the school were already performing worse. So again, in response to this, to account for this fact, we're going to look within a school and within a year and just compare classrooms in the same year and school, so that there's no scope for natives moving, nor is there a scope for selection into different schools because it's the same one. Okay? And that's how I address concerns. The reason I can look across classrooms is because I am going to assume classroom assignment is as good as random. And classrooms work a little differently than they do here. You are assigned a classroom, and then students spend all the school day in the same classroom, all the school year in the same classroom, and teachers are the ones who come and go. So if you have a set of classmates, those are going to be your classmates for the whole day, and you're going to interact the most with them. Okay? And there's no established practice of tracking or putting children who are performing the best together and children who are performing the worst together. There's no math honors class or something like that. And importantly, parents and students are usually not able to ask for a particular classroom A or B or whatever. This is something I will explore more in the future, but from a few interviews I conducted, principals don't have a clear sense of how to reallocate students across classrooms. Some of them try to separate friend groups that misbehave together. Some of them separate couples so that they're not together. But there wasn't a clear relation between past performance and classroom assignment. So if you have two classrooms, say one school I in 1 year, like 2015, we can basically compare one classroom that has only Peruvians with another one that has Peruvians and one or more Venezuelans. And we are going to control for classroom size, which they are already similar because they are in the same school. And so what we find when we compare the performance of the Peruvians here with the performance of the Peruvians here, it's going to be the effect of the only difference between the classrooms. The only difference being that one has a Venezuelan student instead of a Peruvian student. So that's basically the idea behind the identification. This is what I mentioned a second ago. What if classroom assignment is not really random? What if someone is putting all the Venezuelans in the classroom with the worst performing kids? So we're going to control for past performance of natives, and we're going to do a bunch of robustness tests to make sure that's not affecting the results. In the past, people seem to believe I addressed that correctly. Okay. So this is the specification. This is the variable of interest, it's just the number of immigrants in a classroom. This is the class size. So again, we're not identifying the effect of having a bigger class. We are identifying the effect of a change in the composition of a class given a specific class size. And these are just some covariates and the school by year fixed effects, which means we are comparing classrooms within one school year unit. So these are the results in boring format. This is the main result that I mentioned before, is the 0.018 standard deviations of a decrease in math performance per immigrant. This is controlling by past performance of the natives, so that if classroom assignment was related to past performance, this is accounted for. We can additionally control for past performance of the natives' classmates. So if classroom assignment is not only influenced by the performance of one student, but by the average performance of the set of students, that's also accounted for. We can also use past grades from the second grade. And these two are two samples that come from a simulation exercise where we compute how likely it is that a given school year is allocating their students randomly. If we keep the schools in which that is most likely, well, results don't change much. So we basically need to focus on these coefficients and the fact that they are not statistically different from one another. The second row is just showing the same for reading. This shows things graphically. So this is the effect. This is for math. So minus 1.8% standard deviation, sorry, and then if we look at the effect when we control in a different way for past performance being a factor, well, basically we see that the confidence intervals overlap in all the lines. So that suggests that the effect doesn't change much when controlling in different ways. And that just gives us confidence that we are indeed recovering a causal effect. Yep. Okay, so that is the main result, that I would say the first result, that we have a negative effect. And then we go on to try to interpret this effect. So I asked two questions here. What characteristic of immigrants is affecting the natives? How is it that they are causing this negative effect? And what's the mechanism behind that impact? So as I mentioned before, Venezuelan immigrants are new students. So I now will focus on Peruvian students who are not new to their high school. I will call them incumbent students. And I will use a different set. Instead of using the number of immigrants, I will use the number of new Peruvians to see what's the effect of that. And this is, I think, the most important result of the paper. One more immigrant has this effect. One more new native or new Peruvian has this effect, and they are, again, very similar. We should, again, focus on the fact that taking into consideration the confidence intervals, the effects are not too far apart. And so whatever new natives have as a characteristic that is affecting other natives is also a characteristic of the Venezuelans. And the one more salient shared characteristic is that they are new to their high school. If we look at this interacted with other terms, so this will be how much an immigrant affects natives and how much more that effect is for women, or how do the effects change when the native student has a higher or lower socioeconomic index. How much do the effects change when the immigrant student has a higher or lower past performance? Basically, we want to compare this first line with this first line here, so that the interactions or the heterogeneous effects, the different ways in which both shocks affect male and female natives, are also similar between one more immigrant and one more native. And again, the different effects in which both shocks affect natives of different socioeconomic backgrounds are similar, so this line and this one. And the way both shocks affect different immigrants of different past performance are also similar in these two lines. So all in all, if we look at the effect of one more immigrant versus the effect of one more new native, the impact is very similar. The whole pattern of heterogeneity is very similar. So again, it's not conclusive, but it's suggestive evidence that the important characteristic of immigrants that is affecting natives is the fact that they are new to their high school. And this is important in the literature because there has been some research about the student mobility in the US, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, and how a lot of new students came into new high schools in a different state. But this kind of research never speaks to research on international migration, and I think this is a step towards linking those bodies of research. Okay, so now that we know the characteristic of immigrants that's important, then we can, before that, we can look at the regression form of the graphs I just showed you. This is the effect on math and reading of the number of immigrants. And we see the 3 stars that signify statistical significance. If we were to add to that regression the number of total new students, so the number of immigrants plus the number of new natives, those stars disappear. And that just means the initial shock of number of immigrants is no longer important. It's no longer what's driving the results. So newness is more important than status as immigrant. So once we get that, then there's the chance that the immigrants are affecting the behavior of teachers, or they are affecting the behavior of the native students. I'm unable to observe teacher behavior. I can only observe teacher experience, and I don't find any change in the impact of an additional immigrant on the performance of natives. when they have a teacher with more or less experience. So that doesn't seem to be the channel. What I find is the independent learning, or a measure of effort that I mentioned before. And it seems that both having an additional immigrant and having a new native as a classmate decreases the effort of the other natives in the classroom. Again, this might mean that they are spending less time studying and more time with the new students. Could be making friends, could be antagonizing them. It's not clear, but they are re-optimizing how to allocate time. Okay. So this is the first study, as I mentioned briefly, to link this literature of immigrant students with the one on student mobility. It's an obvious but overlooked fact that a student who comes into a different country is going to be a new student. A lot of the literature on immigrant and education focuses on immigrants that have been in the country for a long time, but there's a lot of cases, as we talked in the beginning, of people who are just relocating, especially in the case of refugees. There are suggestive results that these results are driven by the fact that immigrants are new to the school instead of something that's particularly inherent to immigrants. And incumbent native students appear to change their behavior as more new students enter the classroom. We shouldn't draw on policy from just one study. Policy comes from the literature, but to the extent that we can get some valuable insights, this interpretation of a student, an immigrant student being also a new student, is a novel and subtle way of seeing the immigration shock. And then it cautions policymakers to think carefully before designing policies, where it could be more beneficial to train teachers to accommodate new students instead of focusing on immigrant students. And that's it. The question I still had on this project, and one that I'm working on, is the other side of this population, what's happening with the immigrant students and whether they are being discriminated against or not. That's another project. But all in all, that's my contribution to the discussion on immigration. Thank you.
Thank you, Renzo.
Of course.
So now we're going to have a couple questions from the audience and from anybody online. Okay, our first one here.
Gracias, Renzo. Thank you so much. It's an incredible set of results that you are having here. But I have a question in a more general sense is, are you reacting to some sort of response from society in Peru about the amount of new students pressuring the public school system, and, for instance, policies that have been developed to address the issue of the impact of these new students within the school system in Peru? Is there any discussions going on? Because this research will, and you are saying in a very humble way, and thank you for doing that, that this is part of a conversation that has to be started. But are you reacting to something that is going on? Have you been, looking into how the policy allocations or budget allocations into schools are being affected by the presence of migrant students within the system?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think I initially got into the topic because I was reacting to the news. In 2019, I was still living in Peru, and there was a very different reaction to the first Venezuelans who arrived in the country than 1 or 2 years later. And we look at the legal policies that were put in place. Peru was very lenient. They gave a residence permit to everyone. Then 1 year later, it was harder to get it. You needed some more documents, and now it's very hard. So I think there's a lot of, maybe what's happening in a lot of countries with immigration flows, people changing their views and starting to make assumptions and having some misconceptions. In Peru, I saw a lot of labor market concerns, that immigrants will take our jobs and that kind of thing. I know some principals in some schools denied admission to immigrants, even when there were slots. But I don't think there were any specific education policies. I think the government reacted more on the general citizenship space, and then I think over time, because the migration was so massive, it kind of just became part of the student culture, and then COVID happened, and so I think there's still a big discussion to be had about how do immigrants that have now been in the country for a while interact with natives, how do they interact with the state, and how will we, Peruvians, respond to new immigration flows. But to answer your question, I was reacting to policies on a more general sense.
Gracias por tu presentación. I have a question about whether you accounted for public or private schools, and also how do you account for the different departments, you know, in Peru, or did you focus only on big cities or also smaller cities? And I'm passing it.
Thank you. That's a great question too. So I didn't mention this. Peru has public and private schools, but private schools are not necessarily expensive. There's a lot of variation in tuition cost. So people from all socioeconomic status can go to private schools or public schools. And there's also no residence requirements. You can enroll in whatever school you want in the country. So I have both public and private schools here. Private schools are around 75% and public schools 25%. I started with the whole country, with all regions, but because I need to focus on schools which have classrooms with different numbers of Venezuelans, I ended up focusing only on urban Peru. So it's basically the coast and a couple of big cities outside the coast. But it's not just Lima or just a couple of regions. Venezuelans went to all the regions, and even within the sample, there's multiple regions.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a similar question. So since you just said that you focused on urban regions, do you think this data could be generalized to the rural regions of Peru, or like even to other countries outside of Peru?
That's a great question. I think economists tend to focus on internal validity, which is how much will people believe this is a causal effect and not just a correlation. And it's hard to balance that with external validity. So these conclusions readily apply to this sample. It's not easy to make them as generalizable as we would like. That said, I think some of the mechanisms here and some of the features that are highlighted, like the fact that the newness of immigrants is what matters, and the fact that students are reacting by exerting less effort, could very likely apply to rural contexts or even neighboring countries. Yeah, as Miguel mentioned, this is trying to start a conversation, and it's not attempting to solve the question completely.
So this is from somebody online. It says, thanks for inspiring and sharing. Since the research is based on a large sample, I wonder if you may share more about the data collection process.
Yeah, of course. I didn't collect any data. I was lucky to ask the Ministry of Education for data, and they gave me anonymized data of all the students in the country. And then I kept the A graders because they have a standardized test. I know people work with Peruvian data. It's easier to get if you're Peruvian, but if not, it's also possible. Happy to talk more about that. Yeah, I just, in case it's interesting to anyone, there's a lot of countries in the global south that have very good data. And so when we see research not involving developing countries, lack of data is not always the reason. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I had a question about time span and some longitudinal research that may or may not exist in the literature for immigration studies and possibly more domestic literature around education and impact. But I'm thinking about multilingualism and dual language education, and how some of the, as far as I understand, some of the short-term performance measurements really change when you look to longer term. So, at some point you can take a 1 year, 2 year result and then look more long-term and see that it doesn't only level out, it increases, and there's a more long-term, greatly positive impact. And I'm making an assumption here by and you shouldn't do that with statistics, right? But I guess that's my question. Do you know of any examples that could speak to the assumption I'm making, or this idea that longer term, what could the impact be beyond an initial introduction of students, regardless of their background in a classroom?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very valuable question. I think it's usually hard to look at long-term outcomes. I know, well, this is part of a bigger literature on peer effects, right? So sometimes we have the introduction of peers who have problems at home. These are disruptive peers causing some class interruptions, and they lower the performance of their classmates. And there's studies there that show that there are short-term effects in performance and even longer-term effects in dropout and unemployment and wages. I think there's not enough research on this, but some of these effects are more likely to hold in a longer term because they change behavior in a way that is dramatic. Disrupting class during the whole school year could lead to significantly loss of learning, or changing attitudes that are persistent. Here, maybe if the level of effort is changing in the same year, that might be changing again the next year. So I'm not sure I would expect long-term effects, and I would love to look at that. The reason I don't, even medium-term effects, is because most of the Venezuelan migration occurred in 2018, 2019, which is the last 2 years of my data. So I really can't say much about the dynamics. And I think most research on immigrants, or even on peer effects of other kind, focus on just one screenshot. Yeah, I think it would be great to follow these people into university, see if there's any effect there, let you know if I can do it.
Thanks, Renzo. That's a great topic. Question, with the immigration, has there been any responses from parents, from Peruvian or Venezuelan parents with this transition?
It's a good question. So what I know from a handful of interviews with principals and teachers is that Venezuelan parents tend to be more involved than Peruvian parents. They go and talk to the teachers, they ask about their children. I don't know if they have different responses in terms of being concerned about the other group. I know in the surveys conducted in 2017, 2018, there was a lot of complaints from Venezuelans about discrimination in the workplace, in the school, in the street. but the question was asked in a general way. There was no specific follow-up about involvement in schools. So I don't know much apart from the couple interviews I conducted. Yeah, were you thinking something specifically?
Just inputs from parents. Parents may they may object the curriculum in Peru,
Right.
or maybe just saying, hey, I don't want my kid in that school, or I do want my kid in that school, because things are getting better for him there, so forth. And maybe the Peruvian parents are saying, well, because of the rate of learning that my kid is not getting, I'm objecting to it, or so forth. And maybe the community's coming together and said, hey, we want to stop this altogether. So that's why I asked for parent input.
Yeah, no, I see your point. There's another paper who looks at Peruvian parents moving their children away from schools with immigrants. They find that Peruvians do that, but then the children doesn't necessarily learn more than before, so it's not worth it. I think in a more general sense of complaining about immigrants in schools, I think parents were not exactly doing that, but mostly not as parents, but as citizens complaining about immigrants in general.
Thanks, Renzo. I had a question just about newness, and if the effect of newness, you can measure that in immigrants as well, and if that attenuates the longer that a Venezuelan immigrant is in a Peruvian classroom, if that effect attenuates over time, and the same with folks in there, and then also just how common is newness across schools? Is it 20% of the class that's turning over? Or this is a rare occurrence where it's 2 students are new in a classroom any given year.
Good questions. So the first one, 94% of the Venezuelans in my sample are new to the school. So it's hard to look at the second year they're in a school or the third year they're in a school, because most of them, they just got there. I could try it. It's going to be underpowered. And this ties into the longer term effects, that because the shock was so prevalent in the last couple of years of my data, it's hard to look at farther down the line. Now about school mobility, around 9% of students each year come from a different school. So as I said, there's no residence requirements. Parents can basically move their children to any school. Maybe they moved, or maybe they now can afford a better school. For any reason, they move their children. And there's a lot of variation here, but in a 30-student classroom, sometimes you will have 3, 4, up to 10 new students. For the immigrants, you will have from 1 to 4 or 5 immigrants.
One more question on newness.
Of course.
Can we assume that the students that are coming in, I wonder if we're assuming homogeneity between native students, or are those likely, I'll say that again, sorry. Are students that are new and native likely to be, how often are those from the same community? Could we track that at all? Or coming from I would think if someone maybe from California in my classroom in North Carolina as an immigrant in some ways, or new in certain ways, that I'm just trying to think about the idea of difference in a classroom, and if that's an effect of the newness.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can observe where the student was studying before. So I can. So I could really separate new students that come from the same region and new students that come from a different region. I haven't done it because I wanted to first highlight that these are natives, and so the difference between these new students and the other new students is that it's natives versus immigrants. I think it would be an interesting exercise. I wonder if it's different, I think, being from Lima, from the capital, than being from outside the capital. Maybe that's the main heterogeneity to look into. Thank you.
Okay. I have a lot of questions because it's very interesting. It's very relevant to also for what we observe in other countries, right? So I want to piggyback on Ricky's question about language and the newness of the homogeneity or not of the new students. Mm-hmm. And then I want to add another question about, sorry about that, but the assessment, you know, like, how do you, so you said that they take a standardized test at 8th grade. And what is have you done any measurement on how other students perform in this assessment when there isn't any new students in general? And then the question about language is, as we know, Venezuelans have speak a different variety of Spanish, and they're very noticeable. But also, if you have new students coming with different accents from Peru as well, uh-huh. and is there anything that can account for that, for linguistic differences or linguistic discrimination against people with accents that don't belong into their communities, and then in the long run, I mean, I'm glad that you say that it is not the immigration that is defining the poor performance of the students. That is something else, the newness. But the newness, for me, it is more complex than not, right? So, in just being new, how would you explain that just by being new, it is impacting the performance of the students? And my last question, and I promise I'll stop, is did you compare the performance of the Peruvian students compared to the Venezuelan students in that standardized test?
Thank you. Let me start by the last one before I forget. So what would be ideal here is to know how the Venezuelan students were performing before they left Venezuela. And so we could talk about these are high-performing students or low-performing students who are coming into the country, and these effects are explained because of this or that. We don't know anything from Venezuela. We can observe their performance after they are in the country. Sadly, only 10% of Venezuelans took the standardized test. But if we compare that sample, they actually perform better than the Peruvians. If we look at the report card grades, which are more subjective, their performance is more similar. The Peruvians do a little better. This is getting to my other project, which looks at whether teachers were discriminating against Venezuelans in grading. But for this one, I don't use Venezuelan grades at all. So it's just informative to know not all of them took the standardized test. Now the previous question, you remind me? Yeah. Yeah, so I do observe where each student was born. And I haven't used that information much. I could, instead of having just new Venezuelans and new Peruvians, I could have new Venezuelans, new Peruvians from region 1, region 2, region so forth. Yeah, maybe there's a sense in which students from a region with a very different accent are going to be treated closer to immigrants. That's an interesting question I haven't tried. I think, again, this will happen probably for people that are coming from the jungle or regions far from Lima to Lima. Yeah, it's something I should try. It's a good idea. And there were 2 more questions that
I think I just forgot all my questions. No. I mean, I think it's the newness of the
Oh, right.
of the children. You know, it seems to be more complex than just because I don't think they are homogeneous in terms of the I don't know economic status or education, previous education and stuff like that. So that was just my general question about newness.
No, I think it's also valuable. Newness doesn't make the question simpler. It just changes the path of the answer, I think. And we should start by characterizing better what newness means. And yeah, I guess policy-wise, there's a lot of complexity into integrating new students into a high school. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We want to give Renzo another round of applause.